on a crisp, tension-filled morning, the kind of morning where the air seemed to hold its breath, something happened that no one could have predicted. It was the kind of event that would leave a lasting mark on anyone who witnessed it, an event that would ignite a powerful conversation about race, power, and justice. In the middle of a bustling city, in the most public of places, a confrontation between authority and integrity unfolded that would shake everyone who saw it. The story begins with General Marcus Thompson, a respected military leader with a reputation for honor and duty. A man who had risen through the ranks through sheer merit, bravery, and an unwavering commitment to the service of his country. He had led soldiers in battle, made difficult decisions, and earned the respect of everyone who served under him. But none of that mattered to the officer who would soon cross his path on that fateful morning. Officer James Mitchell, a white police officer, had never been known for his subtlety or his capacity for understanding the complexities of the world around him. His actions were often driven by assumptions, his decisions were based on what he thought he knew, and his authority was something he wielded without hesitation. On this particular morning, Officer Mitchell had no idea who he was about to encounter. When General Thompson stepped out of his car, dressed in his uniform and carrying the weight of the day's duties, he was simply going about his business, unaware that his life was about to be disrupted by an unjust act of authority. The moment he crossed paths with Officer Mitchell, however, everything changed. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. Officer Mitchell, without any clear reason or provocation, stepped up to the general and demanded to see his identification. His voice was firm, authoritative, but lacking in respect. He wasn't asking for information. He was making an assumption based solely on appearances and bias. Thompson, who had earned every badge and title through years of service, found himself being questioned as if he were a suspect rather than the respected officer he was. The audacity of the moment left everyone nearby stunned. The general, ever the composed leader, tried to remain calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation. But as Officer Mitchell pressed on, ignoring the general's explanations and credentials, it became clear that this wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about procedure. It was about something much deeper, something far more troubling: bias, prejudice, and the overwhelming power of assumptions. Onlookers began to gather, their curiosity piqued by the unusual scene unfolding before them. They watched as a man who had served his country honorably, who had commanded respect from those who knew him, was being treated with a level of disrespect that no one could understand. Some stood in disbelief. Others whispered in confusion, unsure of what was happening. But one thing was certain: no one expected what would happen next. As Officer Mitchell continued to demand that the general prove his identity, the situation began to spiral out of control. The crowd started murmuring louder, some even voicing their confusion and outrage at the officer's behavior. It was clear that what was happening was not just about a misunderstanding, it was about something deeper, something more systemic. The officer's actions were based on assumptions, stereotypes, and a dangerous willingness to abuse his authority. But Marcus Thompson wasn't just any person, and he wasn't someone who would tolerate such disrespect without a response. At that moment, the crowd went silent, waiting for the inevitable clash. Would this escalate into something bigger? Would this encounter turn into an all-out confrontation? Or would the general remain calm, as he had done countless times before, and de-escalate the situation with his wisdom and authority? The truth was, none of the onlookers could predict what would happen next. What they didn't know was that General Thompson, despite the disrespect being shown, had one move left that would not only shut down the officer but would leave everyone in the crowd, and those watching from a distance, completely shocked. In a moment of pure, unexpected brilliance, Marcus Thompson did something that no one expected. He didn't react with anger, he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't escalate the situation in any way. Instead, he did something that would forever change the way everyone in that crowd saw the power of authority, respect, and dignity. What he did next was the ultimate demonstration of how a man, even in the face of injustice, can respond with such poise and strength that it leaves his opponents powerless. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Officer Mitchell was standing tall, believing his authority would carry him through this moment, convinced that his position as a police officer gave him the right to challenge anyone, anytime, without question. But as he stood there, demanding identification from someone who had earned every bit of respect, he didn't realize that he was about to be confronted by a man who had been through battles far more complex and dangerous than any he had ever faced. As General Thompson took a deep breath, he looked at Officer Mitchell, then the crowd, and with an air of unspoken authority, he began to speak. His voice was calm, his words deliberate, and each sentence carried a weight that forced everyone around him to listen. It wasn't just the words themselves that stunned everyone. It was the manner in which he delivered them, the quiet confidence that turned the entire situation on its head. But before anyone could process what was happening, something happened that would leave everyone frozen. Officer Mitchell, still standing tall, about to say something else to further assert his power, was suddenly stopped by the general's quiet but piercing words. What followed next would not only surprise the crowd, but change the course of events for everyone involved. The story was just beginning, and the tension was far from resolved. What would happen next would challenge everything people thought they knew about power, respect, and the way authority should be exercised. Stay tuned to find out how General Thompson turned the tables in the most unexpected way possible, and how it changed the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The air hung thick with tension as the general's words echoed through the crowd. Officer Mitchell stood frozen, his face flushed with confusion and anger, while those around him began to murmur, some uncertain, others growing increasingly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. It was a standoff, but the roles weren't clear. One man stood in his uniform, a symbol of power and authority. The other, a man who had earned his stripes through years of service and sacrifice, who had faced battles in lands far from home, not of his own choosing, but of duty. Yet here, in the bright light of a bustling city square, their roles collided in a way that no one expected. Officer Mitchell, still gripping the radio in his hand, tried to regain control of the situation. He had never expected to be confronted like this. This wasn't how he had envisioned his day unfolding. He was a police officer, someone who thought he had the right to ask questions and make judgments. In his mind, this was a simple case of checking the identity of someone who didn't seem to belong in the neighborhood. He was simply doing his job. But the presence of General Marcus Thompson, with his calm authority and poised demeanor, threw everything into disarray. The general had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let this encounter escalate into something worse. But it was clear that the officer wasn't going to back down easily, especially in front of a growing crowd. He wasn't accustomed to people questioning his authority, especially not in front of witnesses. For a moment, his grip on the radio tightened, as if he was preparing for the worst. But before anything else could happen, Marcus made his move. "You have a job to do, officer," the general said, his voice carrying through the air, clear and unwavering. "But so do I. And today, your job is to respect mine. You'll find that I've earned everything I've achieved with hard work, not by wearing a badge." It wasn't just what Marcus said, it was the way he said it. There was no anger in his voice, no hint of malice, just a quiet strength that seemed to pierce through the tension. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a calm declaration of authority that was impossible to ignore. It was as though he were reminding the officer of the respect that should be given to every person, no matter their rank or uniform. The crowd fell into a strange kind of silence. Some people exchanged uneasy glances, others began to take a step back, sensing that something deeper was at play here. The officer, who had been so sure of his position just moments before, now found himself momentarily speechless. His face reddened, his posture stiffened, and the air between him and the general crackled with unspoken tension. But Marcus wasn't done. The general knew that he had to make his point. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been unjustly judged or treated unfairly based on nothing more than their appearance. His entire life had been about pushing back against the prejudices that tried to define him. He had faced these types of challenges before, on the battlefield, in the halls of military command, and even in the hearts and minds of those who doubted him. This wasn't a new battle. It was just a different kind of war. I've served this country, fought for its freedoms, bled for its people, Marcus continued, his voice growing more measured, but still steady. I didn't do that to be harassed by someone who sees nothing but the color of my skin. You want proof of who I am? Ask yourself, what kind of man do you think I am, based on your assumptions? But if you really want to know, you'll have to do something most don't. Look beyond your badge and see the person in front of you. His words were sharp and precise, hitting Mitchell like a physical blow. The officer, despite himself, began to take a small step back, a momentary flicker of doubt crossing his face. But his pride was still strong, and he wasn't willing to back down completely. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. This was about control, about maintaining the narrative that he was in charge. But how much could he control when the truth was staring him in the face? As Marcus stood there, waiting for the officer's next move, a couple in the crowd began to speak. The wife, an older woman with a quiet but firm voice, leaned into her husband. I don't think he knows who he's dealing with, she whispered, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of concern and fascination. This man is a general. Her husband nodded in agreement. He's right, though. No one should be treated like this. Not like they're some common criminal, just for the way they look. The bystanders were starting to come around, but Officer Mitchell, clearly on the defensive, still refused to accept the reality of the situation. He was beginning to recognize the gravity of what was happening, but his pride was still in full force. He wasn't going to let his own lapse in judgment define him in front of so many people. His gaze shifted between Marcus and the growing crowd, but the words he wanted to say were stuck in his throat. The silence was deafening now, almost as if the entire world had paused to watch the unfolding drama. No one knew what would happen next. Everyone was holding their breath. Would Marcus keep his composure and leave, or would he push the officer even further? Would Mitchell apologize, admitting that his assumptions were wrong, or would he double down and try to arrest the general, risking the consequences of escalating the situation even more? Just when it seemed like the stalemate would stretch on indefinitely, something unexpected happened. A figure from the crowd, someone who had been watching quietly, stepped forward. It was a teenager, a young black boy, no older than 16, who had been standing at the edge of the group, absorbing the tension. With his head held high and a quiet sense of purpose, he walked up to Marcus Thompson and, without saying a word, offered him a small nod of respect. The teenager's simple action, so full of meaning and courage, sent a ripple through the crowd. It was a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of the general's dignity, a recognition of the strength in his calmness. In that moment, the young boy seemed to embody everything that the general stood for, the quiet strength that came from within, the resilience that only time and experience could forge. Marcus met the teenager's gaze, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. There was something about the young boy's silent solidarity that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the words or the confrontation, it was about the silent agreement between them, a mutual recognition of the fight that was still ongoing. Marcus gave the teenager a nod of gratitude before turning back to Officer Mitchell, who now seemed to be realizing the severity of his mistake. But the moment was far from over, and the crowd was still waiting for the next move. The story was far from resolved, and the real question was now, how far would Officer Mitchell go to hold on to his pride, and how far would Marcus Thompson be willing to push for justice in a situation that seemed to be designed to break him? The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing second, and it was as if time itself had slowed down. The faces in the crowd were a mix of expressions, some of disbelief, others of silent judgment, a few even whispering to one another, unsure of how to react. But one thing was clear. No one had expected this confrontation to escalate like this. Officer Mitchell, despite his initial resistance, was now visibly struggling to keep control. His hand still gripped the radio, but it felt like it was tethered to a sinking ship. The weight of his actions, the error in judgment he had made, was beginning to sink in. But he wasn't willing to back down, not yet. His pride wouldn't allow it. As Marcus stood there, unwavering, his eyes locked on the officer, it was clear that the general was waiting for him to make the next move. His calm demeanor, the the quiet strength in his posture, was in stark contrast to Mitchell's increasingly erratic movements. There was no question that Marcus could have reacted in anger. With a military career filled with moments of injustice and adversity, he had seen more than his fair share of discrimination. But this moment, here in the middle of the street, wasn't about revenge or even about personal pride. It was about something much bigger. It was about respect. It was about humanity. And as the crowd grew restless, it became evident that there was more at play here than just a confrontation between a police officer and a black man. There were layers of history, of systemic injustice, and of personal experiences that were being woven into this very moment. People began to shift their focus, not just on what was happening between the two men, but on how they themselves were complicit in a society that had allowed these tensions to fester for so long. Among the crowd, one young woman, a college student, felt the stirrings of something deep within her. She had been standing in the back, unsure of how to react, but now her resolve was hardening. She had seen the headlines, heard the stories of black men and women unjustly harassed, arrested, and even killed by those who were supposed to protect them. It had never been so personal, never felt so immediate. The scene unfolding before her was a reflection of every injustice that she had read about, studied, and even participated in by staying silent for so long. Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the officer. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is how things work here," Mitchell spat, his words dripping with contempt. It wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was a challenge. "You think you can come here, disrespect my authority, and get away with it? You've got another thing coming." The general didn't flinch. His response was calm, but cutting. "I'm not here to disrespect you, officer. I'm here to make sure that you understand the power of respect. You're the one who's been disrespecting me, not the other way around. But if you can't see that, then maybe it's time we start looking at the bigger picture." The officer's face reddened. His fists clenched at his sides, but there was no swing, no blow. Instead, there was just the growing realization that he was losing control. People in the crowd were beginning to voice their opinions, their voices quiet at first, but growing louder with every passing moment. Some shouted encouragement to the general, others looked at Mitchell with disdain. The pressure was mounting, and Officer Mitchell felt cornered, like a man trying to put out a fire with his bare hands. But just as it seemed like the officer might lash out, the unexpected happened. From the other side of the street, a car came to a screeching halt, its tires screeching as it slid into the curb. A figure jumped out, immediately heading toward the crowd. It was a woman, tall, sharp features, her uniform unmistakable. The onlookers parted as she pushed her way through. A few people murmured, recognizing the woman as a respected detective from the local precinct, Detective Emily Harris. Emily had been watching from a distance, her gut telling her that something wasn't right. She'd been monitoring the scene on her shift, and when she saw the crowd start to gather, her instincts kicked in. As she made her way toward the officer, her eyes locked on Mitchell, and there was no mistaking the disappointment in her gaze. She had worked with him for years, knew him well enough to understand his weaknesses. But today, this wasn't about the badge or rank, it was about a much deeper issue. "Mitchell," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The officer flinched as he turned to face her, and for a moment, he looked almost relieved. But that relief quickly turned to guilt when he realized that Emily wasn't on his side. She wasn't there to back him up. In fact, it was clear from the way she carried herself that she was there to rein him in. "You don't know who he is," Mitchell started, his words coming out in a rush. "This guy's trouble. Emily held up a hand to stop him. "I don't care who he is, Mitchell. You don't get to treat anyone like this, not on my watch." Her gaze shifted toward Marcus, who was standing tall, unwavering in the face of the officer's aggression. There was no fear in his eyes, just the same calm authority that had disarmed everyone up until now. "He's a general, Emily," Mitchell muttered, his voice low and hesitant. "A military general. You saw how he's been talking to me. He's trying to embarrass me." "Not everything's about you, Mitchell," Emily replied sharply. Her voice held the authority of someone who had seen enough to know when a situation was getting out of hand. "This is about respect. You think you can just intimidate someone because of who you are? Just because you wear a badge doesn't mean you can push people around. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Every word that Emily spoke hit like a hammer, shattering any illusions that Mitchell had about the situation. Marcus Thompson wasn't just any man. He was someone who had earned the right to stand his ground. And now, as the detective stood beside him, it became even clearer. This wasn't a battle between a cop and a civilian. This was a moment of reckoning, a moment where the true nature of power, authority, and respect was being called into question. Mitchell's eyes darted between Emily and Marcus. His next move was critical. He had no backup, no way of retreating from this. The realization of what he had done began to settle in, and with that realization came the crushing weight of his own insecurity. He wasn't the only one with power here, and this wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about the boundaries of human dignity. The crowd, sensing that the officer was on the verge of a breakdown, held their collective breath. What would happen next? Would Officer Mitchell back down and apologize? Would the situation spiral out of control? Or would something more profound unfold, forcing everyone to confront the truths they had long avoided? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. The tension wasn't going away anytime soon. The silence that followed felt thick, like the calm before a storm. The crowd, once buzzing with energy, seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on Officer Mitchell, waiting for him to make his next move. His hands were trembling slightly, betraying his outward bravado. Every second felt like an eternity, as if time had stretched to the point where even the smallest decision could alter everything. Marcus stood firm, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked on Mitchell. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just an overwhelming sense of calm. But beneath that calm was something far more powerful, the quiet certainty that he was in the right, that his dignity could not be compromised. He had seen too many moments of injustice to let this one slide, but he wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't here to humiliate the officer or anyone else for that matter. This was about something bigger, a system that needed to be held accountable, a society that needed to confront its biases. Mitchell's breath came in shallow bursts as he looked from Emily to Marcus, his mind racing. He had seen his own authority slip through his fingers before, but this was different. This wasn't just some minor infraction. This was a moment that would define him. It could break him or build him up, depending on what choice he made next. The weight of that realization began to sink in, and his face flushed with a mixture of frustration and fear. Emily, standing beside Marcus now, could see the cracks in Mitchell's confidence. She had been on the force long enough to recognize when someone was over their head, and it was clear that Mitchell was drowning in his own arrogance. He had misjudged the situation from the start, and now it was spiraling out of control. "Mitchell," Emily said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't you. I know you. You've made mistakes, but you don't have to make it worse. Step back. Let's talk about this." Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he might listen. He glanced at Emily, searching her face for some sign of support. But what he found there wasn't reassurance, it was disappointment. She wasn't going to bail him out of this one. He had crossed a line, and now it was up to him to fix it, or to let it unravel entirely. In the background, whispers grew louder, circulating through the crowd. People were exchanging looks, each one seemingly asking the same question. How is this going to end? Would Mitchell take the high road, or would he escalate things further? The atmosphere was electric with tension, and every move felt crucial. Marcus, still calm, took a slow, deliberate step forward. It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple act of moving closer to the officer, to bridge the gap between them, not physically but symbolically. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a reminder that respect wasn't about power. It was about recognition, about understanding that everyone deserved to be seen and heard. But Mitchell didn't see it that way. To him, it felt like another challenge, another push against his already fragile authority. His pulse quickened as he took a step back, his eyes darting around as if searching for some way to regain control of the situation. But no matter where he looked, there was no escape. The people around him were no longer on his side. The realization hit him hard, he was alone in this. And then, Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a voice from the crowd called out, sharp and clear, "You've got no right to treat him like that." The words pierced the silence, and heads turned to see who had spoken. It was the young woman from earlier, the one who had been standing quietly, unsure of what to do. Now, she was stepping forward, her face set with determination. Her words had an immediate effect. The crowd seemed to rally around her, the energy shifting. It wasn't just one voice now. More people began speaking out, calling for fairness, for accountability. It was as if the crowd had been waiting for someone to take the first step, to challenge the officer openly. And now that it had happened, they couldn't stay silent any longer. Mitchell's eyes flicked nervously from Emily to the young woman and back to Marcus. He felt cornered. His pride, his authority, all of it was hanging by a thread. He had been trained to de-escalate situations, to keep control of the narrative. But this was beyond his ability to manage. The more he tried to force his will, the more the situation slipped further from his grasp. The young woman didn't back down, her eyes locked on the officer. "You're a public servant," she said, her voice rising with each word. "You're here to protect, not oppress. And you've failed." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Mitchell's resolve wavered. He was no longer the one in control. And then, to make matters worse, a voice called out from behind him. "Officer Mitchell, step aside." It was a command, not a request. And it came from none other than the chief of police himself. The chief, a tall, imposing figure, pushed through the crowd, his face set in grim determination. He arrived just in time to witness the unraveling of his officer's control, and it was clear from the way he moved that he wasn't here to offer any leniency. "Sir," Mitchell stammered, his voice faltering as he turned to face the chief. I was just doing my job." The chief didn't respond right away. His gaze shifted to Marcus, taking in the general's calm, the way he stood with unwavering dignity despite the escalating situation. And then, with a quiet nod, he turned back to Mitchell. "You've done more than your job, Mitchell. You've created a spectacle, and not the kind we need." The chief's words cut through the air like a knife. Every person in the crowd felt the weight of those words. Mitchell's actions had led to a breakdown, not just of control, but of respect for the very system he was meant to uphold. For a moment, there was silence once more, as if the chief's presence had temporarily suspended time itself. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and everyone was waiting to see what would come next. Would Mitchell be reprimanded? Would the chief take action against him? Or would this just be another moment of injustice swept under the rug? The eyes of the crowd were on the chief now, and the moment seemed poised on the edge of something monumental. The weight of history, of collective memory, seemed to rest on his shoulders. Would he rise to the occasion and bring resolution, or would this moment slip away like so many others before it? As the chief turned to face the crowd, his voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "This will not stand. We will address this, and we will make it right." The crowd waited. As the chief's words hung in the air, the crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, it felt like everything had come to a standstill. But just as the chief was about to speak again, a new voice cut through the silence, a voice that no one had expected. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen." The words came from a figure emerging from the back of the room, stepping into the light. It was someone none of them had seen before, a man dressed in a sharp suit, his face stern and unreadable. The crowd went still, and Mitchell, Emily, and even the chief turned to look at him. There was a sense of recognition in the air, though no one could place it immediately. His presence seemed to charge the atmosphere with even more electricity, raising the stakes of an already volatile situation. The man walked forward with a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze fixed on the chief. "You've been misinformed," he said, his voice cool but commanding. "This incident, it's bigger than you think." The chief's eyebrows furrowed as he took in the unexpected arrival. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his tone sharp, but the underlying uncertainty was clear. The man didn't flinch. He stepped forward again until he was standing just a few feet away from the chief. His presence was magnetic, demanding attention, and everyone in the room felt it. "I'm Special Agent Carter from the Department of Justice," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "And I'm here to ensure that this situation is handled properly, without further escalation." The words landed like a bombshell, and the room seemed to explode in whispers. "Carter? The Department of Justice?" The chief's face shifted from confusion to concern, but his posture remained rigid, trying to assert control over the situation. "This is a local matter. You're out of your jurisdiction." Agent Carter's lips curled into a tight smile. "Not anymore. This is now a federal matter. You've got a serious problem on your hands, Chief." The implications of his words sent shockwaves through the room. The chief's authority was being undermined right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do about it. He turned his gaze to Mitchell, who stood behind him, his face pale. The officer's confidence had completely evaporated, and it was clear he had no idea how to handle the situation now. Mitchell opened his mouth, as though to protest, but Carter silenced him with a single, cold look. "No more mistakes, officer. This is beyond your reach." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the situation hung over everyone like a storm cloud, the tension thick enough to suffocate anyone who wasn't used to the high-stakes drama unfolding before them. Carter, standing unwaveringly, glanced briefly at Marcus, who had been watching the scene unfold with a sense of quiet understanding. The general's stoic demeanor was a stark contrast to the panic now evident in the officer's eyes. Agent Carter's attention turned back to the chief. "The reason you're going to want to step aside," Carter continued, his voice never wavering, "is because this isn't just about a simple case of misconduct. This is about something much larger. Something that could bring down your entire department." The chief's jaw clenched, his hands instinctively curling into fists as the gravity of Carter's words set in. He had been in law enforcement long enough to understand the weight of what was being implied. Something larger? A scandal? A cover-up? The possibilities raced through his mind, but none of them made him feel any better. "I'm warning you," the chief said, his voice tinged with barely contained anger. "You don't know what you're dealing with here." But Carter was unfazed. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Chief. And I'm prepared to take it all the way." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "This is just the beginning." The air felt charged, and a hush fell over the crowd. The drama that had been unfolding, with all its intense emotions and power struggles, now seemed to pale in comparison to what Carter was implying. What did he mean by "this is just the beginning"? What larger game was he talking about? And how deep did this go? The chief's face paled, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. He had seen corruption in his years on the force, but the suggestion that it might reach his department or even higher was a new level of terror. His position was precarious now, and every move he made from here on out would be scrutinized with intense focus. Behind him, Mitchell shuffled uneasily, and even Emily seemed to be caught off guard by the turn of events. But Marcus remained calm, his gaze steady as ever. He was no stranger to high-stakes situations, but this felt different. There was something about the way Carter moved, like a man who had seen and done things most people couldn't even imagine. It was clear that whatever was happening right now was bigger than anyone had expected. The arrest, the confrontation, none of it was about the officer anymore. It was about something far more dangerous, far more entrenched. The crowd, sensing that this moment was a turning point, murmured in hushed tones, exchanging confused and worried glances. Some were worried for the chief, others for Officer Mitchell, and still others felt the pull of the bigger picture that was beginning to unfold. Was this all about a single act of injustice? Or was it something that stretched much further, involving forces none of them could see? Agent Carter turned to face the room once more, and his eyes swept over the people gathered there, the silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. "Make no mistake," he said, his voice echoing in the room, "the truth will come out. No one is above the law." The weight of those words sent a shiver through the crowd. What truth? What law? Everyone was on edge now, desperate to understand what was really happening, but no one dared to speak up. As the tension mounted, one thing was certain. Whatever had brought them to this moment whatever had set this chain of events in motion, was far from over. In fact, it felt like they had only just scratched the surface of something much bigger and much more dangerous. And as Agent Carter's eyes met Marcus's, there was a silent understanding between them, a shared realization that the stakes had just been raised to a level no one could ignore. The room fell into an eerie silence, everyone holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Carter's words hung in the air, as if time had momentarily stopped. The chief was visibly sweating now, his face pale and his fists trembling at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but instead, he took a step back, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Do you think you can just walk in here and tear everything down?" The chief's voice cracked, the weight of Carter's words seeming to crush him. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Agent." But Carter was unmoved. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and I'm not here to back down." He paused, his gaze cold and unyielding. "I'm here to expose the truth." For a long, tense moment, the chief and Carter locked eyes. Then, in a flash of movement, the chief reached into his coat pocket. The entire room tensed, unsure of his next move. Was he reaching for a weapon? Was he going to attack? But just as quickly, he pulled out a small, inconspicuous envelope. He handed it over to Carter, his hands shaking. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Carter took the envelope, his gaze flicking from the chief to Marcus, who had been watching the exchange quietly, his expression unreadable. As Carter opened the envelope, a single sheet of paper slid out, its contents quickly drawing his attention. His eyes scanned the paper rapidly, and for the first time, the calm demeanor that had defined him began to crack, just slightly. His brow furrowed, and his lips tightened in a way that told everyone in the room that what he was reading was far more than just a piece of paper. It was a bombshell. "What is this?" Carter asked, his voice low but laced with disbelief. His fingers trembled as he read through the paper again, more carefully this time. The chief, breathing heavily, took a step back, watching Carter's reaction closely. "I think you need to know what's really going on here," he muttered, almost in a whisper. There was a tremor of fear in his voice now. Carter's eyes never left the paper as the pieces began to fall into place. The documents in the envelope painted a far darker picture than anyone had anticipated. As he read, it became clear. The corruption that had been suspected wasn't just limited to local officers. It stretched all the way to the highest echelons of the department. And worse yet, it implicated some of the most trusted figures in law enforcement, individuals Carter had once considered allies. His breath caught as he processed the implications of the documents. This wasn't just a rogue officer trying to make a bad arrest. It was a coordinated effort to cover up a vast network of corruption and criminal activity that had been festering for years. It was worse than anyone had imagined, and now it was all coming to light in a single, devastating revelation. The room was tense, but the silence was shattered when Agent Carter finally spoke. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice hardening. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Chief." The chief's face darkened, but he said nothing. His eyes betrayed his fear, and it was clear he was no longer in control of the situation. The balance of power had shifted, and he could feel it. He had underestimated Carter, and now, it was too late to do anything about it. "You thought you could cover your tracks," Carter continued, "but it's all here. All the evidence we need. The lies, the deals, the cover-ups. Everything. It's over." The crowd, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, seemed to exhale collectively. The weight of what was happening finally started to sink in. The pieces that had seemed so disjointed were now fitting together, and what had once been a chaotic confrontation was now coming to a slow, inevitable conclusion. But just as it seemed that Carter had everything in hand, the unexpected happened. A sudden, harsh voice cut through the room. "Not so fast." Everyone turned as a figure stepped forward from the back of the room, a familiar face emerging from the shadows. It was someone no one had seen coming, Mitchell, the officer who had been at the center of it all. But he wasn't the same as before. His uniform was disheveled, and his expression was far more intense. There was a wild, almost desperate look in his eyes. I knew it wasn't right, Mitchell stammered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. But I didn't think it went this far. I didn't think it was this deep. The room fell into complete silence again, everyone staring at Mitchell, unsure of what to make of his sudden intervention. He wasn't an ally to anyone anymore, but he wasn't an enemy either. He was a man caught in the middle of a system that had betrayed him, a system that had used him for far too long. I've been a part of this for years, Mitchell continued, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. But now I see what's really going on. I see what I've been a part of. He looked around the room, meeting everyone's gaze one by one. And I can't be a part of it anymore. The revelation was enough to send a ripple of shock through the crowd. The officer who had seemed so composed earlier, the one who had tried to make the unjust arrest, was now breaking down in front of everyone. He was a broken man, torn between his duty and the moral consequences of his actions. But there was more to his story, something that no one expected. Mitchell took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Carter's. I have something else to tell you. Something that'll change everything. Carter's eyes narrowed, his suspicion peaked once more. What is it? Mitchell took a step forward, his voice low but urgent. I know who's behind all of this. I know who's been pulling the strings from the start. It's not just the chief, and it's not just the department. There's someone else. Someone much more dangerous. The words hung in the air like a time bomb waiting to explode. The room was silent again, the tension unbearable. Who? Carter asked, his voice sharp. Mitchell's gaze flicked to the general standing in the back of the room, Marcus's quiet but powerful presence, now a focal point. It's him, Mitchell said, pointing toward Marcus. The room went deathly quiet. What had seemed like an open-and-shut case of corruption within the police department now twisted into something far darker. The implications of Mitchell's words were staggering. If the person everyone had trusted, Marcus, a man who had been seen as a symbol of integrity, was really the one behind it all, then nothing in the room was what it seemed. But before anyone could react, Marcus spoke, his voice calm, but with an edge of finality. You've misunderstood. The twist, unexpected and shocking, left everyone reeling. Was Marcus involved? Or was he being framed? The answers were nowhere near clear, but one thing was certain. The stakes had just been raised to a whole new level, and no one would leave this room the same. The room was thick with tension, the weight of Mitchell's revelation pressing down on everyone. All eyes were on Marcus, who stood motionless, as if frozen by the sudden turn of events. Carter took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The trust he had placed in Marcus, a man he'd admired for years, now felt like it was hanging by a thread. You're accusing me? Marcus's voice was steady, calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a glint of doubt, perhaps even a flicker of betrayal. He wasn't sure if he could trust anyone in this room anymore. But before anyone could respond, Mitchell stepped forward again, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. No, I didn't mean it like that. What I'm saying is, Marcus doesn't know everything, okay? He's not the one pulling the strings here. His eyes were wide, desperate. It's bigger than us. It's bigger than the department. The confusion in the room deepened. Carter's suspicion only grew. He had known Mitchell was conflicted, but this was a game changer. How had they all missed this? Could they really have been in the dark about something so vast? The corruption within the police force was already deeper than Carter had ever thought, but Mitchell was suggesting a far-reaching conspiracy that stretched beyond the department's walls. Carter didn't know what to believe anymore, but he had to focus. Who is it then, Mitchell? He asked, his voice thick with urgency. Who's behind all of this? Mitchell shook his head, his face a mixture of regret and fear. You'll never guess it. It's someone you least expect. He took another step back, seemingly too overwhelmed to continue. Carter could feel the pressure building. They were on the edge of uncovering something that could change everything. The system they had believed in, the structure that upheld their city, was unraveling right before their eyes. And then, with a suddenness that caught everyone off guard, Marcus stepped forward. His shoulders were squared, and his voice rang out with an authority that commanded the room's attention. "You're right, Mitchell," he said firmly. "I don't know everything. But I'm not going to sit here and let false accusations ruin everything we've worked for." He looked at Carter, his gaze piercing. "You want to know who's behind this? Look no further than the man standing next to you." There was a stunned silence, and for a moment, Carter thought he had misheard. Was Marcus saying what he thought he was saying? He turned to Mitchell, eyes narrowed. "You're saying it's me?" Marcus shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "No, not you. The one who's been orchestrating all of this. It's the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. The chief's close associate, the man who's been feeding him information, manipulating everyone's moves." His gaze flicked to the corner of the room, where an officer had been standing silently, watching the entire exchange. Carter followed his gaze, heart racing. In the corner, a tall figure stepped forward. The room gasped. It was none other than Officer Davis, a veteran officer known for his loyalty to the department, and, in Carter's eyes, a man above reproach. But now, standing in the light of Marcus's words, he looked like anything but the honorable officer everyone had believed him to be. "Davis," Carter's voice was low, a sense of betrayal rushing through him. How had he not seen this coming? The pieces were finally falling into place, but it felt like they were slipping through his fingers. Davis met Carter's gaze, a cold smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't think I'd let you take the credit for all this, did you, Carter?" His voice was smooth, but there was a hardness to it. "You're too naive. You've been playing in the same sandbox as all of us, but you never realized you were just a pawn." Carter's mind raced. The revelation was almost too much to process. Officer Davis, a man he had trusted, had been the architect of everything. The lies, the corruption, the cover-ups, it was all him. He had been pulling the strings from the shadows, and they had all been too blind to see it. Davis continued, his tone mocking. "I made sure you all played your parts. It's the way it's always been. But now it's my time. And you, Carter, have just been a means to an end. Did you think you were the only one who had connections? That you were the only one who could expose corruption? No, my friend. This has always been bigger than you." He took a step toward Carter, his expression twisted with malice. "You were never meant to win." The air in the room grew heavy with tension. For a moment, Carter didn't know what to do. His world had just shattered. The weight of betrayal from someone he had considered an ally was almost unbearable. But Marcus, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward once again. "This is over, Davis," Marcus said, his voice unyielding. "You've been caught, and you're not going anywhere. The system might have been in your hands for a while, but no more." He turned to Carter. "We've got the evidence. Everything you need to bring this to an end." Carter's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The man who had been behind all of it was finally exposed. Davis's grip on the department was loosening, and it felt like the first real chance at redemption they had. The confrontation in the room was far from over, but Carter felt a sense of clarity. For so long, it had felt like everything was a tangled mess of lies, but now, it was all making sense. Davis's role in the corruption was undeniable, and with Marcus's help, Carter knew they had the leverage they needed to take him down. Davis stood there, a dark expression on his face, but his confidence was fading. He could sense it too. His time was up. His empire was crumbling. "You won't get away with this," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "You've underestimated the system," Marcus said, his voice like steel. "It's not just about power. It's about integrity. And we're taking that back." With those final words, Carter knew the fight wasn't over, but it was beginning to turn in their favor. The darkness had been exposed, and the light of truth was shining through. As the room began to empty, Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had taken down one of the most dangerous men in the system, but the battle was far from won. There was still more to be done, more corruption to root out, more truth to uncover. But one thing was certain. This fight for justice was far from over, and they had just taken the first major step toward reclaiming their city.